There were 6 unmarked cars on my parents' street by 7 in the morning, and I counted every one of them twice before I let myself believe what I was looking at. My name is Rachel. I'm 36. I work as a marketing director for a healthcare logistics company in Asheville, and on the morning I'm about to tell you about, I stood on my parents' front lawn in my husband's oversized coat, watching federal agents carry bankers' boxes out of the house I grew up in, while my younger sister stood on the porch screaming 4 words that would end our family exactly as we'd known it. It was his idea. She was pointing at our father. 65 years old, a retired postal supervisor who had never once in his life raised his voice at a dinner table. Standing in his bathrobe on his own front steps while a woman in a navy windbreaker with FBI stenciled across the back read him something from a laminated card. My mother was behind him in the doorway, one hand pressed flat against her chest like she was trying to hold something in that had already gotten out. And Vanessa, 32, my baby sister, the one I used to walk to the bus stop, the one whose hand I held through our parents' brief separation when we were kids, the one I had spent the last 3 years quietly, fiercely defending to anyone who dared question her. Vanessa stood there in yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, mascara running down a face twisted into something I had never seen on her before. And she was pointing at our father like he was the one they'd come for. He wasn't. Not really. But by the time that morning was over, it would take my parents 11 more months, one federal prosecutor, and everything I had left in me to prove that. I need to back up, because you can't understand what happened on that lawn without understanding what came before it for years of small, deniable things that I explained away one at a time. The way you talk yourself out of noticing a house is on fire, because you can only see the smoke from one window at a time. My parents raised Vanessa and me in a modest brick ranch on Birchwood Lane, the kind of house where the furniture doesn't match because none of it was ever meant to be replaced, just repaired. My father worked for the Postal Service for 31 years. My mother taught 3rd grade for 28. They were not wealthy people. What they had, the house, paid off, a modest 401k my father had contributed to faithfully since he was 26, a small pension, represented every dollar of discipline 2 working-class people could accumulate across 4 decades of showing up, every single day, to jobs that were never glamorous and never optional. I got married 8 years ago to Mark, a structural engineer with a laugh you can hear 2 rooms away, and we have a daughter, Sophie, who was 9 that year and who loved her grandparents' house with a specific, uncomplicated devotion only children have for places that smell like a particular brand of dish soap and always have the good cereal. Vanessa never married. She built her whole identity, instead, around Lumen Wellness, a startup she launched 6 years ago with her college roommate and my own closest friend since our sophomore year at UNC, Jenna, 35, sharp as a blade. The kind of person you'd trust with your car keys, your secrets, your children. Jenna was Lumen's CFO. Vanessa was the face of it, the founder, the visionary, the one who'd flown to New York twice to pitch on stages I'd watched live-streamed from my living room, cheering into a glass of wine like the proudest sister alive. 3 years before that morning on the lawn, Lumen Wellness needed a bridge round of funding it couldn't get from venture capital, because I understand now, though I didn't then, venture capital firms have due diligence teams. And due diligence teams ask questions Vanessa could not afford to have answered. So she went to the one source of capital that trusted her completely and asked nothing in return. She went to our parents. I remember the dinner where she brought it up. Sunday, spring, my mother's chicken and dumplings on the stove. The specific golden light Birchwood Lane gets right before 6 p.m. in April. Vanessa laid out a pitch deck on the kitchen table, the same one I'd learn later. She'd shown investors full of growth charts that climbed at angles that should have made anyone pause. She asked our parents to invest $700,000, their entire retirement. Every dollar of the 401k, the pension buyout my father had just become eligible for, even a portion of the house equity line. I sat at that table and said nothing. That's the thing I need you to understand about me before we go any further, because I am not going to sit here and tell you I'm only the person this happened to. I am also the person who watched my little sister ask our aging parents to hand over their entire financial safety net for a company I already had quiet doubts about, and I said nothing. Because saying something would have meant risking the one role I had spent my whole life perfecting in that family, the protector, the one who believed in Vanessa when no one else fully did, the one who smoothed things over so nobody at that table ever had to sit with real conflict. If you've ever watched something happen that you knew, somewhere underneath the noise of a pleasant dinner, wasn't right and said nothing because speaking up felt like betraying someone you loved, you already understand exactly the position I was in that April evening. 3 years before 6 unmarked cars parked outside my parents' house. My mother cried a little that night, not from sadness, but from pride. "We finally get to be part of something," she said, squeezing Vanessa's hand across the table. My father, quieter, asked exactly one question: "Are you sure this is smart, Van?" And when Vanessa answered with the specific, practiced confidence of someone who has said the same reassuring sentence to a dozen different investors, he nodded and signed. I didn't know yet how many other signatures he'd end up attached to that he never actually gave. For the first year after my parents wired the money, everything about our family looked, from the outside, like a success story. Lumen Wellness, a subscription platform that promised to match users with personalized supplement regimens based on at-home blood testing kits, moved into a real office downtown, glass walls, exposed brick. The kind of space that photographs well for a pitch deck. Vanessa hired 6 employees. She got written up in a regional business journal, a photo of her standing with her arms crossed in front of the Lumen logo, the caption calling her Asheville's next wellness disruptor. My mother framed the article and hung it in the hallway between baby pictures of me and Vanessa, right where everyone walking to the bathroom would see it. Sunday dinners that year had a different energy than any I remembered from childhood, bright, hopeful, full of Vanessa's updates about user growth and partnership talks. My father, a man who had spent 31 years being invisible in the way postal workers often are, seemed to stand a little taller talking about his daughter's company like it was partly his now too, which, in the most literal financial sense, it was. I want to be honest about something. I was happy for her. Genuinely. Whatever unease I'd carried from that April dinner faded, week by week, under the steady drumbeat of good news. I told myself the doubt I'd felt at the table was just older sister anxiety, the kind you get used to feeling and mostly ignoring, because Vanessa had always found a way to land on her feet ever since we were kids. The first thing that didn't sit right came about 8 months in, small enough that I explained it away within the hour. Jenna and I met for coffee, a standing Thursday ritual we'd kept since college, one of the few constants in both our increasingly busy lives, and I asked, casually, how the Series A conversations were going. Vanessa had mentioned, at the last dinner, that a Charlotte-based VC firm was close to signing. Jenna's face did something small. A flicker, gone almost before I registered it, the kind of pause you'd only notice if you'd known someone 11 years and had watched that exact face do 100 other, more genuine reactions. "It's in progress," she said, and changed the subject to Sophie's upcoming birthday with a speed that, in hindsight, was its own kind of confession. I didn't push. Jenna was a numbers person, careful about what she shared even with close friends, and I told myself that was all it was, professional discretion, nothing more. Something similar happened with my father around the same time, though I didn't learn about it until much later. He mentioned once, almost offhand, over a Saturday morning cup of coffee, just the two of us, that Vanessa had asked him to sign a few more forms for the accountant. Nothing unusual, he said, just paperwork tied to the initial investment. Standard stuff. He said it the way you mention renewing a magazine subscription. I remember thinking nothing of it at the time. I understand now that the few more forms, said in passing, without detail, without either of us asking to actually see them, was the first thread in what would become a rope long enough to hang a family with. I want to stop here for a second, because I think if you've ever loved someone enough to let their confidence stand in for your own judgment, you already know exactly the quiet way that trust gets used against you. I trusted Vanessa's competence the way you trust a bridge you've driven over 1,000 times. It never once occurred to me to check the foundation. The second year told a different story, though I only recognize the shape of it now. Lumen's public momentum kept climbing, a partnership announcement with a regional grocery chain. A segment on the local morning news where Vanessa demonstrated the at-home blood test kit with the easy charisma she'd had since she was a teenager, talking her way out of curfew. But underneath the public momentum, small behavioral things started shifting in ways that, at the time, I filed under busy founder and that I now recognize as the earliest visible cracks. Vanessa started missing Sunday dinners, not occasionally, the way she always had, but with a new kind of frequency, always with the same explanation: investor calls, board prep, a crisis with a supplier. When she did come, she left her phone face down on the table and checked it constantly, a habit she'd never had before, glancing at the screen with a quick, tight movement of her eyes that reminded me, uncomfortably, of the way Jenna's face had flickered over coffee. She also stopped talking about specific numbers. In year one, she'd rattle off user counts, retention rates, revenue projections with total ease, like she'd memorized a script she believed in completely. By the second year, when my mother would ask, proudly, how things were going, Vanessa's answers got vaguer, really strong, better than expected, right on track, phrases that sounded confident but told you nothing. The specific verbal fog people generate when the real numbers aren't ones they want to say out loud. I noted it, the way you note a strange sound in your car's engine and decide, because you're busy, because the car still drives fine for now, to deal with it later. The engagement moment that finally cracked something loose came at the end of that second year, at Sophie's 9th birthday party. Of all places, a bounce house in our backyard, 20 screaming third graders. My mother handing out juice boxes with the specific joy she reserved for grandchildren's birthdays. Vanessa arrived late, hugged Sophie, handed her a gift, and then pulled our father aside near the fence line for what I assumed was a quick hello. I happened to walk past close enough to catch fragments, not eavesdropping, just proximity, the kind you can't avoid at a backyard party, and what I caught was Vanessa's voice, tight and fast in a way I'd never heard from her, saying something about, "Just until the bridge round closes, and I need you to not mention this to Mom yet." I didn't hear enough to understand what this was. I told myself, walking back toward the bounce house to referee an argument about whose turn it was, that it was probably nothing, some minor financial detail, business as usual, none of it my concern since I wasn't the one who'd invested. If you've ever caught half a conversation that some quiet, unnamed part of you already understood was important, and let yourself walk away from it anyway because dealing with it felt like more than you had capacity for that day, you already know exactly why I kept refereeing bounce house arguments instead of turning around and asking my sister what she meant. I know some of you already sense where this story is going. I didn't. Not yet. What I found out, 18 months later, standing on that same lawn watching federal agents carry out bankers' boxes, would make that half-heard conversation by the fence line one of the loudest things I've ever failed to listen to. The unease that had been living quietly under my ribs for 2 years started, in the third year, to take a shape I could no longer talk myself out of. It began with my mother, not Vanessa. My mother, who called me most Tuesdays just to talk, mentioned almost in passing one week that she and my father had needed to move a few things around to cover a home repair, a new water heater, nothing dramatic, but that it had been tighter than usual. I remember pausing over that sentence because my parents' finances, for as long as I'd been an adult, had been steady in a way that felt almost boring. Tight was not a word I associated with them, not since I was a teenager and my father had been between routes for 6 anxious months. I asked, gently, if everything was okay. She said, of course, don't worry, just retirement adjustments, the kind of vague reassurance parents give their adult children when they've decided worry is a burden they'd rather carry alone. I let it go. I had a full-time job, a 9-year-old with a packed after-school schedule, a marriage that needed tending like any marriage does. I told myself my mother was a capable adult who would tell me if something was truly wrong, and that assumption, that someone will tell you the truth simply because the truth matters, turned out to be one of the more expensive assumptions I've made in my life. The next sign came from Jenna, and it was the first one I couldn't fully explain away, because it involved a direct, undeniable inconsistency instead of a feeling. We were at our usual Thursday coffee spot, and I mentioned, casually, that Lumen's grocery store partnership seemed to be everywhere lately. I'd seen the branded display at 3 different stores that week. Jenna's answer didn't match what I'd seen. She said, with a strange, clipped certainty, that the partnership had actually been paused for renegotiation the month before. I remember sitting with that contradiction for a full 3 seconds before deciding not to say anything, because pointing out that my own eyes disagreed with my best friend's professional summary felt, in the moment, needlessly confrontational. That's the flaw in me you need to understand by now, if you haven't already. I have spent my whole life protecting the people I love from the discomfort of being questioned, and calling that protection loyalty, when really, some of it was just fear. Fear of being the person who breaks a family's peace by asking the hard question out loud. Something in Jenna had shifted too, and by that spring I could no longer explain it away as busyness. She started declining our Thursday coffees more often, twice, 3 times a month, always with an apology that felt slightly too smooth, slightly too rehearsed. When we did meet, she talked more than she used to about things that had nothing to do with Lumen, her dating life, a home renovation, anything, I understand now, that kept the conversation as far from her actual job as possible. Once, mid-sentence, she caught herself saying something about the Q3 numbers we're restating and pivoted so fast to a different topic that I actually laughed, thinking she was joking about how boring accounting talk was. She laughed too. It wasn't a real laugh. I know that now. I want to stop here for a second, because this next part is the moment the pressure stopped being something I could carry quietly and started living in my body in ways I couldn't ignore. It was a Tuesday in late September, almost 3 years to the week after that first dinner at the kitchen table. My mother called, and her voice had a wrongness to it I'd never heard before, too bright, too fast, the specific performance of calm that people do when they're actively deciding not to panic. She said my father had gotten a strange letter from their bank about a line of credit against the house that he didn't remember taking out. She said it like a puzzle, not a crisis. I did not experience it that way. My chest went tight in a specific place, right under my collarbone, a sensation I would come to recognize over the following weeks as my body's early warning system working faster than my conscious mind was willing to. I drove to Birchwood Lane that same evening. My father showed me the letter at the kitchen table, the same table where Vanessa had once laid out her pitch deck, and I read a home equity line of credit statement showing a balance of $84,000 my father swore, with the specific, quiet bewilderment of a man who has never once lied to me in his life, that he had never applied for. I signed something, he said slowly, working it out loud as he spoke. Van brought some papers back in the spring, said it was for the accountant, refinancing something on our end of the investment paperwork. I didn't read all of it. I trusted her. I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with tightness this time. It felt more like recognition, the specific, sick feeling of a puzzle piece finally clicking into a picture you'd been avoiding seeing whole. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Mark at 2 in the morning, running the fence line conversation from Sophie's birthday party through my head on a loop, the half-heard phrase, "I need you to not mention this to Mom yet," landing with a new, terrible clarity. I thought about Jenna's flickering face over coffee, her too smooth apologies, the way she pivoted off any question that got too close to actual numbers. If you've ever lain awake doing the math on a betrayal you weren't ready to name yet, piecing together a dozen small moments you'd talked yourself out of one at a time, you know exactly what that night felt like. It's not dramatic. It's just quiet, relentless arithmetic, your mind refusing to let you sleep until you've added everything up. I decided, somewhere around 4 a.m., that I needed to see the actual paperwork. All of it. Not the version Vanessa summarized at dinner tables, not the version Jenna deflected around at coffee. The real documents. I know some of you already see where this is heading. I didn't yet, not the FBI, not the scale of it, not the specific way my sister would eventually turn and point at the man who signed papers he never should have signed. But I knew, lying there at 4 in the morning next to my sleeping husband, that whatever I found when I finally looked directly at what I'd been avoiding for 3 years was going to cost me something. I just didn't know yet how much. I started carefully, the way you approach something you already suspect is going to hurt. My father, shaken by the equity line discovery, agreed to let me help him request full documentation from the bank and from Lumen's accountant, a woman named Priya Patel, whom I'd met exactly twice at company events and who, it turned out, had left the firm 4 months earlier under circumstances no one had explained to my parents. That detail alone should have told me something. It took me another 2 weeks of quiet, careful requests to understand what. I want to be honest about the moral weight of what I was doing, because I don't think I fully appreciated it at the time. I was building a case, essentially, against my own sister, using documents I had access to only because my father trusted me enough to hand them over without asking too many questions of his own. Every folder I opened felt like a small betrayal of the version of our family I'd spent my whole life protecting, the version where Vanessa was brilliant and a little chaotic, but never, ever dishonest, and where my job was to believe in her louder than anyone doubted her. What I found, across 3 weeks of late nights at my kitchen table after Sophie went to bed, was not one clean document that explained everything. It was a slow accumulation, each piece changing the meaning of the last. The home equity line was real, and my father's signature was on it, but when I laid it next to a birthday card he'd signed for Sophie the same month, the signatures didn't match in ways that felt too consistent to be explained by a shaky hand. I'm not a forensic document examiner. I didn't need to be. Even to an untrained eye, something about the loop of the T in Tom was wrong in a way that made my stomach drop. There was a second line of credit, smaller, $22,000, taken against my mother's retirement account 8 months prior, one my mother genuinely had signed, I later confirmed. But under circumstances that made the signing itself its own kind of betrayal. Vanessa had presented it to her, my mother told me later, crying, as just moving money between our own accounts to optimize the tax situation. A description so far from what the document actually authorized that I understood. Reading it, that my sister hadn't simply mismanaged money. She had built, carefully, over roughly 18 months, a structure designed to extract more from our parents than the original $700,000, using language specific enough to sound responsible and vague enough to never actually explain what it did. The third piece was the one that finally made the shape of everything unmistakable, a set of Lumen's actual internal financial statements, which I found not through my parents, but through Jenna, and not because she gave them to me willingly. I confronted her directly, finally, on a Thursday in October, in the same coffee shop where we'd spent 11 years of Thursdays not quite saying things to each other. I laid the home equity documents on the table between us, said nothing, and watched her face do the thing it had been doing in miniature for 2 years, except this time it didn't recover. I need you to tell me what's happening to my parents' money, I said. All of it. Not the summary. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual crispness. Lumen's been underwater for almost 2 years, Rachel. The grocery partnership fell through 18 months ago, actually fell through, not paused. User retention's a fraction of what the pitch decks say. Van's been using new money to cover old obligations, payroll, mostly, and a business line of credit that's personally guaranteed. Your parents' investment didn't build anything. It bought time. And when the time ran out, she went back to them for more, and used documents she knew your father wouldn't read closely, because she knew, she told me this, Rachel, she knew he trusted her completely. I sat with that sentence for what felt like a very long time. She knew he trusted her completely. Somewhere underneath the shock, a colder, clearer thought arrived, one I hadn't let myself think in 3 years. I knew it too, and I let that trust stand in for asking a single hard question, for 3 straight years. Jenna admitted, that afternoon, that she had known about the forged loan documents for at least 4 months had, in fact, been the one who initially flagged to Vanessa that the accountant's paperwork wouldn't hold up. Advice Vanessa had apparently taken not as a warning to stop, but as a note on which specific details to clean up before submitting anything to the bank. I did not tell my parents everything I learned that day. Not yet. I told myself I needed to be completely sure before I detonated something I couldn't take back, a reasonable-sounding justification that was also, if I'm honest, a continuation of the same pattern that had kept me quiet at that first dinner table 3 years earlier. I took photos of every document Jenna showed me. I made copies of the financial statements. I put the folder in a locked drawer in my home office, told no one but Mark, and went to my parents' house that Sunday and ate my mother's chicken and dumplings and said nothing, watching my father across the table. Wondering how many more signatures he'd given away without reading them closely, wondering how much time I actually had left to stop whatever was still in motion. If you've ever built a growing pile of proof and then sat across a dinner table from the people it was going to destroy, smiling, passing the rolls, unable to make yourself say a single word of it out loud yet, you already know exactly the particular kind of exhaustion I was carrying into that November. I want to pause here, because I think some of you are sitting right now with a folder of your own, not literal, maybe, but the emotional equivalent, proof of something you're not ready to say out loud yet. I understand that hesitation completely. I lived inside it for 3 long weeks. What I didn't know, that Sunday at the dinner table, was that I wouldn't be the one who finally forced the truth into the open. The truth was going to arrive on its own, for weeks later, in the form of 6 unmarked cars, and by the time it did, everything I'd gathered in that locked drawer would matter more than I could have imagined. The FBI's involvement, I learned much later, had nothing to do with anything I'd uncovered. Lumen's forged accountant, Priya, the one who'd left the firm 4 months earlier under unexplained circumstances, had filed a report with the SEC after realizing the extent of what she'd been asked to falsify. A report that eventually crossed paths with a broader federal investigation into predatory startup lending practices in the region. My family's fraud wasn't the target. It was the thing agents found once they started pulling threads. The raid happened on a Thursday morning in early December, 6 days after I'd finally, that previous weekend, sat my parents down at their own kitchen table and shown them everything in the locked drawer. I need to tell you about that weekend first, because it's the moment my own reaction finally broke free of 3 years of careful silence. I laid the documents out methodically, the mismatched signatures, the financial statements Jenna had given me, the timeline I'd built connecting every form for the accountant to money that had never gone anywhere near an actual accountant. My mother cried, quietly, the specific grief of a woman realizing her daughter had used her trust as a tool. My father went very still, turning the equity line statement over in his hands like he was hoping the back of the page might explain something the front couldn't. And I found myself saying things I hadn't planned to say, my voice rising in a way it never had at that table before, 3 years of swallowed doubt finally finding its way out all at once. I should have said something at that first dinner, I told myself, really, more than anyone. I sat right here and watched her ask you for everything you had, and I said nothing because I didn't want to be the person who doubted her out loud. That's on me. But what she's done since then, forging Dad's signature, telling Mom it was a tax optimization, that's not something any of us could have stopped by being more careful. That's someone who decided, a long time ago, that your money mattered less than her company staying alive. It frightened me a little, hearing myself say it, not because I regretted it, but because I hadn't known, until that moment, how much anger I'd been carrying under 3 years of careful, protective silence. We called Vanessa that Sunday night. I told her, directly, that I knew about the forged documents, that Jenna had confirmed everything, that our parents deserved the truth and a real plan to fix it before this went any further. She was quiet on the phone in a way that, at the time, I mistook for shock. I understand now it was calculation. For days later, agents arrived at Birchwood Lane at 7 in the morning with a warrant covering both Lumen's offices and, because my father's forged signature appeared on federally insured loan documents, my parents' home as well. I got the call from my mother at 7:14 and was on the lawn by 7:40, Mark driving, while I called Vanessa's phone 11 times with no answer. She arrived at 8:15, in yoga pants, hair unbrushed, and I understood immediately, watching her get out of her car, that whatever version of this morning she'd constructed in the 20 minutes since someone had warned her, it did not include taking responsibility for any of it. She ran up the porch steps toward our father, who was standing in his bathrobe answering an agent's questions with the specific, bewildered honesty of a man who genuinely did not understand what he was being accused of, and that's when she screamed it. Loud enough for the whole street to hear, loud enough that a neighbor 2 houses down actually stepped outside to see what was happening. It was his idea. She said it again, louder, pointing directly at our father, telling the lead agent that Tom had structured the loans, that Tom had pushed her to take investor money when the company was already struggling, that she'd only signed what her father told her to sign. Every sentence was a lie built with just enough truth-shaped material. Yes, our father had signed documents. Yes, money had moved through accounts he'd technically opened, to sound plausible to someone who hadn't spent 3 weeks at a kitchen table matching signatures. I stood on that lawn and felt something in me go past anger into a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. I walked up the porch steps, past the agent taking notes, and I said, loud enough for everyone on that porch to hear, "That's not true, and I can prove it isn't." I told the agent about the locked drawer, about Priya's departure, about Jenna's confirmation of the forged signatures, dated and timestamped in a voice memo I'd recorded, without fully planning to, the day she confessed at the coffee shop. I named every date, every document, every mismatch. 3 weeks of careful, quiet proof gathering finally finding its purpose in the one moment it could actually matter. Vanessa's face, as I spoke, went through something I will never forget, the specific collapse of someone watching their carefully constructed story lose its structural integrity in real time. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. She turned it back on me instead, her voice sharp and fast. "You've been going through my company's private financial records for weeks and you didn't tell me? You've been building a case against your own sister." She said it like I was the one who'd betrayed the family, like 3 years of her silently draining our parents' retirement was somehow less of a violation than my 3 weeks of finally paying attention. Jenna arrived 20 minutes later. Someone from Lumen's office had called her and stood at the edge of the driveway, saying nothing, her presence itself a kind of confession. A woman who had known for months and chosen silence until the silence was no longer an option. My mother finally broke completely, not during Vanessa's accusation, but afterward, sitting on the porch steps once the agents had gone inside to continue the search, her hands shaking around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, saying quietly, to no one in particular, I just wanted to help her build something. My father, who had held himself together through the accusation itself with the same quiet dignity he'd carried through 31 years of early mornings on his mail route, finally sat down heavily on the top step and put his face in his hands. And that was the moment, watching him, that I understood exactly how much this had already cost him, and exactly how much more it was about to. The investigation took 11 months. My father was cleared of all wrongdoing within the first 6 weeks. Once agents cross-referenced the signature analysis, I'd already started with a formal forensic document examiner, who confirmed what I'd suspected at my kitchen table in October. At least 4 signatures attributed to Tom Doyle on loan and refinancing documents were forgeries, executed using a signature stamp Vanessa had ordered, under a business pretext, from an office supply company 2 years earlier. Vanessa was indicted the following spring on counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft related to the forged documents. Jenna, whose cooperation with investigators, including the voice memo I'd recorded and eventually handed over, along with her own subsequent full statement, helped establish the scope of the fraud. Avoided criminal charges, but lost her CPA license and, with it, every professional relationship she'd built over a decade. Lumen Wellness dissolved within 3 months of the raid. My parents' $700,000, along with the additional $106,000 siphoned through the forged loans, was gone in the way money usually is once it's been run through a failing company for 2 years recoverable, if at all, only in fractions, over years, through restitution proceedings that were still ongoing the last time I checked. Vanessa took a plea deal 8 months after the raid, 18 months in federal prison, 5 years supervised release, restitution obligations that will likely follow her for the rest of her working life. I want to tell you what my father lost, plainly, because I think it matters more than the number. He lost the retirement he'd built across 31 years of an unglamorous, faithful job, the specific dignity of knowing he'd provided enough that he'd never have to depend on anyone. He is 66 now, working part-time at a hardware store 3 days a week, not because he wants to, but because the math of his life changed in ways no amount of resilience can fully undo. He lost something else too, quieter and harder to name, the version of himself as a father who could trust his own children completely, without needing to check the fine print of what they asked him to sign. Vanessa lost everything that mattered to her identity, the company, her professional reputation, her freedom for a year and a half, and, permanently, the specific role in our family she'd occupied since childhood. The daughter everyone believed in without question. That belief is gone now, and it isn't coming back, no matter how her sentence eventually resolves. Jenna lost her career and, with it, 11 years of friendship I have not found a way to rebuild, and don't think I will. I don't hate her. I understand, in a distant, clinical way, that she was protecting her own livelihood the same way I was protecting my family's peace, through silence, for far too long. Understanding it hasn't made me able to trust her again. I sat with our father, once, in the months after the plea deal, on his back porch, and asked him if he regretted signing that first pitch deck 3 years earlier, before any of the forgeries, before any of it. He thought about it longer than I expected. "I don't regret believing in her," he said finally. "I regret not asking to see the actual numbers myself, instead of trusting the version she told me across a dinner table." I understood, hearing that we shared the exact same regret, from 2 different seats at that same table. Looking back now, the first red flag I missed wasn't the forged signature or the equity line. It was that pitch deck itself, that first April dinner, growth charts climbing at angles too steep to be honest, and my own silence sitting right beside my parents' hopeful trust. I filed my doubt away that night and told myself it was nothing, because naming it out loud would have meant becoming the sister who doubted Vanessa in front of our parents, and some part of me had built my entire identity around never being that person. I understand something now I didn't understand at that dinner table 3 years ago. Protecting someone's feelings and protecting their future are not the same thing, and sometimes loving someone well means asking the question that risks the peace, instead of the one that preserves it. My silence at that first dinner didn't cause what Vanessa did, but it gave her 3 additional years of a family that never once asked to see the real numbers, and I will carry that particular cost for the rest of my life. There's a moment I keep coming back to, from that morning on the lawn, not Vanessa's scream, though I'll never fully forget the sound of it. It's my father, afterward, sitting on the porch steps with his face in his hands, and the way he looked up, finally, not at Vanessa, not at the agents, but at me. Standing there with a locked drawer's worth of proof I'd been too afraid to show anyone for 3 long weeks. He didn't say thank you, not that morning. What he said, quietly, was, "You believed me." For words that undid me more completely than anything Vanessa had screamed. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to take from this, it's that the silence we mistake for loyalty is sometimes just fear wearing a gentler name. I loved my sister enough to never ask her a hard question for 3 years. I loved my parents enough, finally, to ask every hard question I had, all at once, on a lawn full of federal agents, and it cost me a sister, but it gave my father back his name. What hurts most, even now, isn't the $700,000, though some nights that number still takes my breath away. It's the version of Vanessa I spent 30 years believing in, the little girl whose hand I held at the bus stop, and understanding, finally, that loving someone completely doesn't mean you ever actually knew the whole of who they were capable of becoming. If you've ever protected someone's image so carefully that you missed the moment it stopped being true, I'd love to hear about it. Drop one word in the comments. The person who taught you that silence isn't the same as loyalty, or the moment you finally stopped protecting someone who was never protecting you back. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It's the hardest story I've ever had to tell, and it means something that you stayed for every part of it.